Thanks everyone for coming, and a really big thanks to the organisers. This is a great Evolang, and I want to particularly thank them for raising so much funds for student visitors. It's absolutely fantastic that so many of my students and other students from around the world were able to come here and were supported so generously. So thank you very much for that. A fantastic job. So it's great to be talking at Evolang. It's been, I guess, about 15 years that this conference series is running. And when I was writing this talk, I was thinking back to the first Evolang back in Edinburgh in 1996. And remembering around about that time, I think it was the year before, this book, a book with this cover by John Maynard Smith and Urs Sotmari, two distinguished biologists, had just come out on the major transitions in evolution. And I remember a lot of the talk at the conference was how kind of excited people were that they'd included language as their last, or part of the last major transition in evolution. And it felt very exciting that the biologists thought that language is important. So it's kind of interesting to reflect on that and to see how the field has changed and the relationship between the study of language evolution and biology has shifted as well. But I think it's a good place to start to sort of think about the problem that we're facing in the widest possible context. So why did Maynard Smith and Urs Sotmari put language there as the last of the major transitions? And what they were really interested in was the idea that there are certain points in the history of life where there's a kind of step change in the way information is transmitted. And the reason they put language up there with everything else was because, as Urs puts it, language in our species allows for the unlimited heredity of cultural information. So there's something about the nature of language that allows us as a species to pass on cultural information and accumulate cultural information in radically new ways. So that's why they put it there. So if that's true, that language enables this unlimited transfer of information in a novel way in our species, that's a hugely adaptive trait. So in some sense, it seems like a very reasonable place to start for thinking about the evolution of language, to think, well, if we have language that's enabling our species to do this, and it's enabled us to do things like, build civilizations, extend our habitat out into space. All these things wouldn't be possible without language, without the cultural, unlimited cultural evolution it provides. If that's adaptive, that seems like a reasonable place to start to try and think about the evolution of language. But before we get there, if we get there at all, we need to think about how is it that language is able to do this for us? What is it about language at its most fundamental level that enables us to have this unlimited cultural heredity? Well, I think the answer to that is language has particular, unique structural design features. The kind of things I'm going to be talking about are very, very basic. They really are the first thing that we say to students in the first class in Linguistics 101. These design features of language that are fundamental and basic. And these design features that really give language this unique property of being able to transmit information. And yet, I think we don't have definitive answers for how they got there. And that seems a little bit of an embarrassment if it's the thing that we talk about first in Linguistics 101. So what are these features of language structure that we need to look at? So here's a very sort of cartoonish slide of what I think they are. Basically, when we use language, we're mapping between two domains. We're mapping between a domain of sound, so here's an acoustic waveform, and a domain of meaning in some sense. Okay, so here's an expression in English, two boots. That's the acoustic waveform for that expression, and that's what it means. And the interesting thing about language is that the way we map from one to the other, the way that you decode an utterance like that or an expression like that, it involves various interesting structural properties. And here are two. Here are the two that I think are most important and most fundamental. Firstly, the sound of two boots is made up of meaningless elements that combine. So these are phonetic segments. And secondly, those meaningless elements combine together to make meaningful elements that also combine. So we can think of these two processes, or these two features of the structure of the communication system we're using right now, as combinatoriality in the first part and compositionality in the second. Now, I could have used the word duality of patterning here, but in fact, I kind of don't want to get into the subtleties of it, because there are some very, very interesting and rather technical issues about the term duality of patterning and how it relates to things like double articulation in the history of linguistics that I don't really want to get into. So I'm being a bit more cartoonish here and just saying that there's these two properties of combinatoriality and compositionality in language. If you're interested in this, I'm editing a special issue of Language and Cognition on duality of patterning, where we sort of go into, various authors are going to go into this in a lot more detail. So language is special because it makes extensive use of these two properties, combinatoriality and compositionality. And very few, if any, other communication systems in nature do this. Okay. And it's these two properties that allow us, more than any other property of language, that allow us to convey novel meanings. It means that I can produce sentences to you lot, many of whom I've never met before. I can produce sentences that I've never said before and you've never heard before, and yet you're able to understand me. And it's because I'm able to recombine elements in novel ways using these two properties. And it's that allows language to support a system of unlimited information transfer. And that's why language is important as a biological phenomenon. So these would appear to be very adaptive properties of language. So how do we go about explaining these adaptive structural properties, these adaptive design features? And it seems to me it's the job of all of us in this room to solve this problem. I mean, that's what language evolution should really be about, explaining these. And that's what, many of the talks that I've heard so far, probably all of them, at one level or another, are tackling this question, and that's great. So, what we need to do is think about what kinds of mechanisms and processes might help us solve this problem. Now, there's an obvious one, and that's biological evolution, right? So, this is again another cartoon. It's early in the morning, so there'll be a few of these. But we can think of the process of biological evolution as essentially something like this, that we inherit genes that in some complex process give us brains that have a capacity or a faculty for acquiring language. And so if we want to look at the evolution of this phenomenon, then we can look at the processes that drive the transmission of genetic information, so biological inheritance. And so obviously language evolution must deal with this. It must deal with the evolution of the cognitive apparatus involved in language, the language faculty. But an interesting thing across these series of Evolang conferences has been an increasing emphasis of another inheritance mechanism that's involved with language. And that's cultural transmission. Okay? So the language faculty evolves biologically, but languages themselves, the phenomenon that we're talking about, evolves culturally. Okay, so that's a completely uncontroversial statement, I hope. I mean, certainly we can see it happening. We can see it happening in studies of language change. We can see it happening in studies of creolization. This process by which languages are passed from brain to brain is a cultural process. But it's happening through brains that themselves potentially evolving biologically. So we have these two systems, this dual inheritance of language. And increasingly over the last decade or so, people interested in the evolution of language, interested in the origins of these basic design features, have been wondering whether this process of cultural transmission, has an important role to play in explaining those design features themselves, rather than just focusing on the biological evolution of the language faculty. And we call the study of this process iterated learning, for reasons I hope will become clear. So the study of the particular kinds of cultural transmission that underpin the transmission of language, we call iterated learning. So that's what I'm going to focus on for most of this talk, but then towards the end I'll bring back in this process and see how these two things work together. So the cultural evolutionary approach is what I'm going to be talking about. So I'll just give you a quick breakdown of what we're going to go through in this talk. First, I'm going to review a bunch of experimental work, mostly done in Edinburgh, but not entirely, showing that iterated learning, this cultural process, can deliver us the structural adaptations that I'm interested in. So I'm going to actually review 5 experimental studies. We'll try and get through them. Many of them are presented in more detail in the rest of this conference, so I'll give you pointers to where you can hear these studies in more detail by the people who are actually working on them. So it's going to be an overview of these 5 experimental studies. And then I'm going to move on to a very quick summary of very recent modelling results, also going to be presented here, showing that iterated learning, this cultural process, has extraordinarily significant effects on the way biological evolution operates. And what that means is that we can't just look at one or other of these processes in isolation. We really need to start moving towards we need to start building the theoretical tools that will allow us to bring these two things together, because it changes the game entirely when we look at biological evolution. And then I'm going to conclude with, I suppose, 3 lessons I think that we can draw from this for trying to look for explanations for universal properties of human language. Okay, so first, the experiments. So I guess, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago, it seemed an odd idea that we could do experiments in language evolution. It seemed like there were very, very few experimental psychologists in our discipline. And that's changed enormously. I mean, if you just look at the kinds of things that are presented here and look at the kinds of things that people in various labs are doing, it's a very exciting change, is the introduction of the psychologists into this field. But it's understandable why it seems like, well, how on earth could you build experiments that would tell you anything about the evolution of language? But we think we can, and we can actually study iterated learning in the experiment lab. So the idea here is to try and build, in miniature, a model using real human participants of the process of cultural evolution. And in particular, we're interested in the cultural evolution of languages. So the way this works is we set up what's essentially like a telephone game, but with whole languages. Now, I don't know if you have this game in Japan, but it's a kid's game where I would whisper a sentence into Luke's ear, and Luke would whisper that sentence into his neighbour's ear, and then they'd pass around the room. And the funny thing about the game is by the end, the sentence has changed out of all recognition. But in that process of change, the funny things that can happen are funny because they reveal something about the minds of the people this sentence has passed through. So does this happen in Japan? Some countries don't do it. Oh, good. I'm glad you lot do. That's excellent. Okay, so So this telephone game, as it's called in America, is played with just single sentences, but we had the idea that maybe we could play this game but with whole languages. So the task is that we bring a participant into the lab and we teach them a miniature alien language. And we call it an alien language on the posters to advertise for participants, because we get more participants if we call it an alien language than any other way. So we teach a participant in our lab this alien language, and then we test them on it. Now at this point, there's nothing unusual about this. This is a standard technique, goes back many decades of artificial language learning or artificial grammar learning, and indeed Jenny Safran in her plenary will undoubtedly be talking about experiments like this but carried out with children. So at this point this is completely standard method from psychology, but what we do then is take the participant's output on test and use that as the training data for the next participant that comes in the lab. So we were able to start this experiment off with a particular language that we control, but from that point it's out of our control, so the language will change as it's passed from participant to participant through the experiment. And the idea here is that we can use this technique to study the way the cultural evolutionary process works, given particular human brains. Now, it's very important to realize that there's some rather serious limitations with this. For example, importantly, the participants already have language, and that's something that we have to take into account. But it's important to realize that what these experiments are about aren't studying necessarily those individual human brains, but studying the process of cultural transmission. So we can make modifications to the setup of the experiments and see what different behaviors result in the dynamics of the transmission of the language. And then, ideally, we pair up these lab experiments with computational models to try and work out what's the best explanation for the behavior that we see. But all the way through, we should be kind of humble about the fact that we have participants in these experiments that already have language. So that's obviously going to affect the results. Okay. So, sorry, some of the images are missing here, but for some reason. So this is the first study. So this was published back in 2008 with this joint work with Hannah Cornish and Kenny Smith. And this was the first study that we did where we tried this experimental methodology. And in this experiment, the participants learned strings of syllables like these, paired with structured meanings. Okay, so what I mean by a structured meaning is that the participants were told that the aliens were going to, they were going to hear the alien words for various coloured moving shapes. So, for example, this blue bouncing ball might be called Kalu, for example. The language that we started with in the experiment was a random, completely unstructured pairing between these pictures and these strings. There was nothing, we just got a computer to generate random sequences of syllables and paired them with the pictures. And the training data for each participant in the experiment was a subset of the output of the previous participant in the experiment. There's the pictures, that's nice. And a crucial step that we found that we had to add to this experiment was that at each generation, in scare quotes, after each participant produced their output, we had to artificially remove any ambiguous items. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So, so you as a participant in our experiment would see a bunch of these pictures paired with strings, and then you would be tested on other pictures. You'd be tested on the ones that you saw, but you'd potentially also be tested on pictures that you hadn't seen. But our participants didn't know that, so in fact there's very, very low awareness in this experiment that they were ever even being tested on unseen pictures. So you can imagine if you saw these three words and then you may find it relatively easy to recall them, but if you imagine only seeing two of them, and you were asked to generalize, if you like, to the unseen one, then, well, you basically have no chance. But our participants had to do it anyway. Okay, so we were interested in what happens in this process of transmission of a very simple artificial language like this. So what happens to the language as, like in the telephone game, various kind of errors in copying happen from participant to participant. So I'll just give you, in each of these studies, I'm just going to show you the output rather than any quantitative data. Don't worry, it is there. But I just wanted to give you a sort of flavour of what happens. And this is just a tiny subset of the language. So here's a subset of our random language at the first generation of the experiment, if you like. And this is what it looked like after being passed through 10 individuals, 10 generations later. Now, one of the interesting things is that the participants are incredibly bad at this task. So they essentially score 0. They get 0 correct in the early generations. But by the end, they are getting a very, very high score. So they're learning the language incredibly well. And if you look at it, you might be able to see why. Whereas you can't generalize this language from a subsample, you can generalize this one from a subsample. And it becomes easier to see if I artificially add hyphens in here. So what's happened is that in this process of transmission, a compositional structure has emerged. So there are parts of these strings that correspond to color, parts that correspond to movement, and parts that correspond to shape. And that's just emerged out of this process of repeated learning and production in the lab experiment. And none of our participants were aware, certainly they weren't aware of the structure of the experiment, and most of them were just told us basically that all of them told us that they were doing their best to just give us back what we gave them. And yet, somehow in this process, this compositional structure has emerged. So the conclusion from that first experiment was that this transmission of language from one individual to the next individual to the next individual, something that in cultural evolution terms we call vertical transmission, with this artificial pressure to avoid ambiguity that we added. Recall that we throw away any items in the output that are ambiguous. So if some participant used the same string, same signal for two different meanings, we threw it out. Those things together give us compositionality. And this is an extremely robust result. It's been replicated by a number of labs, and I know some other labs are currently rerunning this experiment, various different settings, the same result. It's one of the most robust results that we've had in experimental contexts in Edinburgh. And also it's been demonstrated in a huge range of computational simulations using techniques as diverse as neural networks to minimum description length grammar inducers. A variety of different techniques give us this result. But notice we had to do this thing, slightly strange thing of artificially removing ambiguous items from the language. So what's going on there? Why did we need that? Well, we decided to run a new experiment, and this is joint work with Monica Tamariz, Hannah Cornish, Kenny Smith, Sean Roberts, and myself. This is not yet published, but papers on this are in preparation at the moment. So we wanted to see if we could remove that artificial step of throwing out ambiguous strings. So we did a new version of the experiment where instead of just having one person at each generation in the experiment, we moved to two individuals. And these two individuals, this dyad in this experiment, interact. They communicate over a computer terminal in a kind of naming game task. So the pairs in our study interact to try and pick a particular picture from a distractor array using the alien language that they've learned. And once these two participants have played this game for a while, then we take their behavior and use that as the training data for the next pair of participants in the experiment. In all other senses, it's very, very similar to the previous experiment. So we just had these dyads interacting at each generation. And we took away this kind of weird filtering step that we had to add in the previous study. And what we find is essentially adding this communicative task does the work for us. It creates structure without needing this ambiguity filtering that we previously had to have. So this is an example of the end result of one of our experiments. Slightly simpler meaning space actually here, so there's only two features. There's shape and texture. But again, I hope you can see that we have a compositional language emerging here. So the prefix here corresponds to shape, and the suffix corresponds to the texture, and we also have sort of an unmarked case that's emerged here. It doesn't happen every time, but in this case, in this particular run of the experiment, we have an unmarked texture there. So that second study, the conclusion we draw from that is that vertical transmission combined with the communicative task gives us this compositionality that we were looking for. So these two things at least seem to be required. But what about this vertical transmission? How important is that? Recall, this is the process of transmitting a language from one generation to the next. So we wanted to see how important that was. So we decided to make a very minor change to that previous study, and rather than having different pairs of individuals at each generation, different people playing these dyads, we actually just had one dyad for each run of the experiment. So basically it was exactly the same setup, but we just kept the same two people in the lab for a very long time. So they learnt the language, they played the naming game, then they learnt their own output again and played the naming game again, and so on. So in all other aspects it's the same. So just the same two people instead of different people each time. So very minor change. But the important thing here is that there's kind of no turnover in the population. There's no transmission of the language to naive new learners. So this is akin in cultural evolution terms to horizontal transmission rather than vertical transmission. So what are the differences, if any? The differences, I mean, this really startled me, actually. It couldn't be more different. So the results, essentially we get no or almost no compositionality at all in this experiment. So this language is an example of one at the end of one of our experiments. Now, it's important to realize that the dyad is using this language perfectly well. They can communicate perfectly, have no problem with it, but there's no or very, very little compositional structure here. So the language has stayed as this kind of idiosyncratic, random pairing of syllables to meanings. So what we conclude from that is that what's really crucial for the emergence of compositionality, at least in these experiments, is a combination of naive learners and communication. So these two things seem to be important. If we don't have communication, then we need some other process to stop the language becoming just completely ambiguous. And if we don't have transmission to naive learners through vertical transmission, then we don't get the structure at all. So the way we're starting to think about this is to try and think of the structure of the languages that's coming out in this process as arising as a trade-off between compressibility and expressivity. So, and these two features of the languages that come out are driven on the one hand by learning and on the other by communication. So, what do I mean by compressibility? Well, if you look at that compositional language that we get in this experiment, it can be expressed in a simple grammar with fewer rules. Fewer things need to be stored in the representation of that language than in the language that has complete idiosyncrasy. So the representational space that language takes up is smaller than in the idiosyncratic language. And that sort of crunching down of the language, we're hypothesizing is being driven by learning. But the most crunched down language you could have, the simplest language you could possibly acquire, would be a language that just used one word for everything. So you could just ugh for every meaning. That's a very, very simple grammar. Representational complexity is very low. But it's incredibly inexpressive. It doesn't distinguish between meanings. So these two forces, this force to reduce the representational space of a language and yet distinguish between different meanings, are in opposition to each other. And they're driven by these two features of the process of cultural transmission, learning and communication. And our hypothesis is that much of the structural properties of language are the result of this trade-off between expressivity and compressibility. And we've replicated this recently in an exemplar-based simulation, showing that vertical transmission and communication are required to get these properties out. Now, an interesting sort of corollary of this, I guess, is that what we should see is this complexity, which is non-compressibility of language, lots of idiosyncrasy, for example. If we do see it in real languages, it should arise in social contexts where there is more shared interaction history, so less transmission to naive learners. So if I was to predict that there'd be a relationship between how compressible a language was and features of the social context, I would predict that in languages where there are small populations with people always talking to the same interaction partners, those would be the cases where you'll get more complex languages. And that rather pleasingly lines up with the kinds of results that Gary Lupian and Rick Dale found in their normothetic study of language and social structure. So that's quite pleasing. You can find out more about all of this experiment in Monica Tamariz's talk at 3:05 on Friday, if you're interested in the details. Okay, so moving on. In all of these experiments I talked about so far, in these three studies, we've been seeing essentially strings of syllables adapting to a particular set of meanings that we, the experimenters, have provided. So we wondered what would happen if we ran a similar experiment but took the meanings out. So we're just looking at just transmitting sequences, essentially. And take out all of the kind of linguistic context altogether and just present it to participants as a sequence learning task. So we set up this experiment where participants just sat down, were exposed to sequences of symbols. And they were simply asked to learn to reproduce these symbols. It was an incredibly boring experiment to just see some sequences and then type them in. We started with a random set of sequences, so maximum entropy set of sequences of characters. And we included a constraint that participants must produce a fixed number of distinct sequences. So participants were exposed to a certain number of distinct sequences, and they were told that they had to reproduce that same number of distinct sequences, and the computer would throw up an error if they typed in one of the sequences twice. So note that that's standing in for this pressure to be expressive. And these are the kinds of results that we got. So this is joint work with Hannah Cornish, Rick Dale, and Morten Christensen. So this is a random sequence of characters at the start of an experiment, and this is a number of generations later through this vertical transmission process. And what you can see here, I hope, is actually we're still looking for good quantitative measures for measuring structure here. So if anyone's got any ideas, talk to Hannah. Visually, certainly, it's very clear that what's happening here is that structure is emerging. So there are subsequences that are reused. In fact, in this case, there's an interesting property of palindromes started to appear. So we have sequences here whose structure is essentially context-free, if you want to take it down that road. But the important point is that this set of sequences, the participants are able to learn and recall these much, much better than those. So in this process of transmission, the set of strings became easier to learn by virtue of gaining structure. So what do we conclude from that? So in this non-linguistic sequence learning task, even without meanings, this iterated learning process leads to this emergence of repeating subsequences. And our hypothesis is that this might provide essentially a kind of foundation on which more structure can emerge. And I wouldn't be surprised if a process like this wasn't going on in some songbirds that culturally transmit their song. That structure, repeating more compressible structure, emerges purely as a result of cultural transmission. So the last study I want to talk about takes this work in a kind of new direction. So all of the studies I've been talking about so far have been kind of focusing on the compositionality end of things. But what about combinatoriality? So all of this previous work has already given our participants on the shelf an already combinatorial signal system. So we have combinations of syllables or combinations of symbols on a keyboard. So these are the elements that are meaningless and can be recombined. So we give that to the participants. But what we would like to do is see if this cultural transmission process could give us those elements in the first place. So can we get from a system of signals that doesn't have that combinatorial structure to one that does? And this is joint work with Tessa Verhoef, Carol Padden, and Bart de Boer. And the idea was essentially to repeat that previous study that looked at just strings of syllables, but use a signaling medium that was continuous. And we hit upon this idea of using swanny whistles. This is a really fun experiment. So all of our previous experiments, participants hated us for it. But for some reason, maybe it was because of Tessa, participants loved this experiment. So they really enjoyed being in the lab and playing with the swanny whistles. But it's essentially the same paradigm. We started with a collection of random whistle sounds created by a large number of participants that had no internal structure. And each participant heard the whistle sound and had to try and repeat it using this swanny whistle, this slide whistle. And the computer would record it, and participants had to try and recall the entire set of whistles that they heard. And just as in the previous experiment, there was the computer provided this constraint that they had to produce a sufficient number of distinct signals. So the software is able to tell on the fly whether a whistle sound that you produced was essentially too similar to one that you'd already produced. Again, this is this pressure that we're building into this experiment for expressivity. So this is the sort of things that we get out of this experiment. So don't worry, you don't have to read this. But the point is that we can get pitch track data from these experiments and see. So coming down the slide is time. So this is the initial set of sequences of whistles, and then down here is the set produced by the 10th participant in this particular vertical transmission chain. I can zoom in on part of that, and this is the sorts of things that are kind of fascinating in this study, that we see these kinds of things emerging. So what you can see here is in these 6 different whistle signals that there's a reuse of elements. So there's this down-up element here, and then these are repeating single notes that appear on different sides and in different number of notes. And what the participant is able to do is reproduce the set of sequences that they hear, because they're involved, they consist of these sub-elements, these meaningless elements that they can recombine in different orders. And in fact, there's also interesting kind of phonotactic constraints in this system. So we typically find kind of rules that say certain combinations don't happen. And those are kind of language specific. So at different times the experiment is run, different effects emerge. And even things like kind of co-articulation effects, so that we have certain subsequences that occur at the same pitch as one of these fall rises. So what do we conclude from that? So the conclusion here is that structure can emerge in which elements are reused along with constraints and combinations just by this process of iterated learning. You can find out much more about this in Tessa's talk at 2:25 on Friday, so this is just like a very quick summary. And one of the things that's exciting about this work is that it suggests a different explanation for phonemic coding than some of the ones that are in the literature. So here, phonemic coding, we suggest, doesn't rely on pressure from a large number of signals, as some have hypothesized, but rather purely as a result of this cultural transmission process. Okay, so the overall conclusions from the experiment section of the talk. So cultural transmission through this iterated learning process has a significant effect on the structure of the behaviors being transmitted. So what we want to say is, if the following is true, that there is a large system to acquire, in other words, there is something that we call a learning bottleneck, so that participants can't simply trivially memorize all of the features of the signaling system or the language that we're exposing them to. If that exists, and there is a pressure on the system to discriminate different meanings or different signals, in other words, that it's used for communication. So if you have these two things, a learning pressure and a communication pressure, then our argument is that these basic design features of combinatoriality and compositionality emerge as a trade-off between compressibility and expressivity. Now, bear in mind that what I've shown you is results from experiments using, as I said before, using participants that already have language. So it could be that what we're seeing is just we're getting back the features of the language that we acquired. The problem with that hypothesis is that we see the same results in computer simulation where we can control exactly what our computational agents have in their heads. And it seems to us that the more parsimonious explanation is this is purely a result of the dynamics imposed by iterated learning itself. Now, I promised you I would talk about the impact of all of this on our biology, and so for the next quite brief section, I'm going to do that. So, I've going to be presenting this view that cultural transmission is all that, right? Cultural transmission is really the game in town for explaining language structure. But I really don't want to dismiss the role of biological evolution. One way in which our work can be taken is to say that these features of language structure aren't innate. Essentially, that they just emerge out of the process of cultural transmission. They don't have to be encoded in any way in our language faculty. But these structural properties of language appear to be very adaptive, right? They would appear to provide us as a species with enormous advantages. And you just have to look at the demographics of us compared to other primate species to see that that's obviously true. That the fact that we have language and the knock-on consequence language has certainly seems to provide us with an advantage. So perhaps one might argue that natural selection should be the mechanism that we're looking for to provide these properties, in some sense, as strong innate constraints. So surely it makes sense if these properties of language are adaptive, then natural selection would encode them in some way in our language faculty. And sort of to try and, bridge that hypothesis with the work we're doing, perhaps what we could say is that this cultural process that I've been talking about, this cultural evolutionary process, could lead to stable universals of language structure that then bootstraps biological evolution through some kind of genetic assimilation. So this is the idea that if we're all speaking these languages that have these structure by virtue of cultural evolution, then biological evolution could end up encoding those in our genes, and therefore we could end up with a language faculty that is innately wired up to expect compositionality and combinatoriality. And indeed, that's a hypothesis that I proposed with Jim Herbert in 1997, and Christensen, Reali, and Chater have written about in various places. So the idea that if cultural evolution can give us some stable universals to work with, then sure, biological evolution can encode those. And more discussion about these models, you can look at Vanessa Ferdinand's poster in the poster session, which I think is today. But a model that we've been working on this year has a very, to my mind, a rather surprising conclusion that the answer to that is a resounding no. Okay, so the cultural process can never lead to the evolution of strong innate constraints. In fact, it seems that the existence of cultural transmission, iterated learning, actually completely removes the possibility of strong innate constraints to arise through natural selection. It's a rather surprising conclusion. So I'll just give you a flavour of the model. And this is a model with Bill Thompson and Kenny Smith. So what we wanted to do was combine what we knew about learning, what we knew about cultural evolution through iterated learning, and biological evolution in one model. And what we did was we simulated a population of individuals, individual agents, that acquire language through iterated learning. And crucially, what we did in this model was we used a technique that allowed us to specify a complete continuum of innateness from very, very weak biases, so that our agents would be born with a tiny expectation that languages would have one kind of feature or another, to completely strong constraints, so that the individuals were born only able to learn certain types of languages. And the way we did that is we specified this continuum has an additive effect of many genes in the model. Now, we used a Bayesian approach for this, and I want to point out here that this kind of flexibility of modeling, which allows you to include kind of many of the standard nativist models as special cases, is exactly the kind of thing that Bayesian modeling is good for, despite what you might have heard. It's an incredibly powerful technique. It lets us specify a continuum from strong innateness on the one hand to domain general, completely uninformative learning on the other. So it's not, using that technique doesn't tie you to a particular stance on the evolution of language or the nature of cognition. It's just a very powerful technique that allows you to explore a very wide space of models. And we implemented natural selection in this model by favouring coordination. So agents who communicate well are favoured. And we even tried implementing natural selection for particular language types, because we wanted to see, are there any conditions under which we could get strong innate constraints to evolve? So we thought, well, the best case scenario for the evolution of innateness is if we reward individuals for speaking a particular language in this model. Surely then we would find natural selection encoding that language innately. And it turns out it doesn't, and it's a surprising result. So I can only really give you a very brief overview. I encourage you to go to Bill's talk, I think it's later today. This is one graph from the paper, and what it shows here is these two lines. This is time along this axis. The dashed line is the kind of external manifestation of language. It's the behavior of the agents. And what we see here is emerging a strong universal. So these agents all speak a particular type of language, and there's very little variation in the population. But this isn't matched by the genes. So this is the language faculty in the model. And what we end up with again and again and again is strong universals of behavior not being matched by strong innateness. Universals can and do emerge sometimes, but strong innate constraints on the learners never evolve. And we see this result replicated with, we've tried 12 different versions of this model. We tried to find all possible ways we could to get basically this line to track that one to strong constraints, and it never happens. So why is this? Just very briefly, what seems to be happening is that cultural transmission radically alters the relationship between genes that control learning and population-wide behavior. So this evolutionary dynamics in this model lead to iterated learning, this cultural process, amplifying the effect of learning biases. And what this means from the point of view of natural selection, and this is in sort of Terry Deacon's terms, culture unmasks the effect of small biases. So small biases in individuals can have a huge effect in the behavior being selected, that's the target of selection. But at the same time, it masks the effect of strong constraints. So what you find is that the genes produce a very, very weak bias that's completely defeasible for one individual, but nevertheless has these strong universals. So you can find out more, as I say, from Bill's talk today at 12:10. Okay, so just to conclude, I think from this kind of work, looking in detail at the effects of cultural evolution on models of the emergence of language structure, there's kind of three, I guess, take-home lessons that I'd want to suggest to you. So where does language structure come from? Well, I think it's a reasonable first hypothesis, at least, to explore that it's possibly all of language structure is essentially a trade-off between compressibility and expressivity. And that trade-off is driven by cultural evolution under pressures from learning and communication. What about the language faculty? Well, I think we can rule out a language faculty that encodes strong constraints as a result of selection for communication. But, and this is important, this does not rule out what Chomsky calls third factor principles. So if we do find that there are features of the language faculty that correspond to strong constraints on the form of languages, we would predict that they are not going to be the result of natural selection for communication. So it's a very counterintuitive argument. But our results say very clearly that you either have weak biases that are the result of natural selection for communication, or potentially strong constraints that are the result of some other process. Now, that I would be perfectly happy for none of those to exist, or for there to be many of them. I just want to say that this work doesn't rule those out. And finally, which design features should a comparative biology of language look for? I have not talked very much about this, but I think a logical conclusion of this work is that really we shouldn't be looking for these features like compositionality and combinatoriality in other species. I mean, it's interesting that if we find them, but really what I think we should be looking for is the pre-adaptations for language. And from our point of view, the kind of design features that we should be looking for in other species are things like traditional transmission, which we find in birds, for example, and social coordination, where we find hints of it in other primates. And that's a rather old picture of the LEC. It's always this sunny in Edinburgh, so come and visit us. Thank you very much.
We have not so long, 8 minutes. Okay.
Thank you very much for this very interesting overview of iterated learning. But I wanted to ask something about your last point about the evolution of constraint. Would this also exclude the ability to evolve biological adaptations like the ability to learn larger lexicons or the ability to evolve the possibility to produce large ranges of sound? Because I would be really unhappy with that.
No, don't worry. No, it's constraints on it predicts that we won't have natural selection giving us strong constraints on the form of languages as a result of selection for communication. So the kind of support apparatus for language, as I understand the models, those are not ruled out as being the results of selection. However, I wouldn't pin an enormous amount of hope on those. I mean, personally, I don't think that there's likely to be masses of ongoing biological evolution after the linguistic system has got off the ground. I mean, because that's what you would need. You would need to say, okay, languages emerged, and then there are significant processes of biological evolution afterwards. I mean, this work doesn't talk to that, but my hunch is that there may be slight tweaking of different parts of our kind of support apparatus, but I don't imagine that there necessarily is a huge amount. But no, the models are strictly talking about constraints on and biases on learning. Sorry, you're chairing. Oops. Andrea. Or who?
No.
Anyone?
Thank you for the very stimulating talk. I have a question about your experiment number 3 with the naming game, which you do not observe the emergence of any compositionality. That's a very nice result, but I was wondering what would happen if you let just two agents play, but you enlarge a lot the set of meanings. At that point, probably the naming game would become a sort of category game, and they would be forced to
So basically what's happening
to develop a code, because they couldn't remember the proper name of any single shape.
So one of the problems of doing these kind of lab experiments, they're small-scale experiments, so everything's scaled down. So you've got parameters, you've got free parameters. So you know, these aren't the size of languages, but they're also the time that we've got participants isn't a lifespan, right? So in any experiment, there's a process of tweaking, for example, the size of the meaning space to make certain results happen. What I would say is that what we expect in all of these cases is that the process of learning by that first dyad of the system is going to have an effect. But then that's that, right? So you'll have, if you enlarge the meaning space, yes, you might well have some compositional structure, and then it would kind of ossify, it would get frozen in place because these participants would have enough time to learn the system. It's the process of transmission to naive learners that has that cumulative effect where the system has to keep getting crunched down. So, but of course, if you make it so large that it's unlearnable, then I suspect you would get more structure. Sorry.
Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. Papadowski, University of Warsaw. Actually, my question relates to the question that Andrea has asked. So basically, in your model, you observe the emergence of compositionality through the process of imperfect learning from the initial stage where you didn't have ostensible compositionality there. Now, I was wondering to what extent this tells you something about the nature of language rather than the nature of the way we conceptualize things. Because it would be, I would normally think that when you've got the first speaker there, and they express a property that is in some way composed of different elements, they would want to use terms that they use for those elements there. So the starting stage would be different. And does this model tell you something about the language or the way or the stage before the linguistic output actually?
Very briefly, I mean, the version of the experiment without that filtering step that I talked about, where we remove ambiguity, you don't get compositional structure, right? So and that's kind of important, that the compositional structure arises from this this implicit drive to keep meanings apart. And in that first experiment, that was an addition that we made as experimenters that the participants couldn't possibly know. So participants couldn't know whether they're in a condition where they were having some of their output thrown out or not. And yet the result is very different. So I think that compositional structure isn't a straightforward result of the kind of way in which individuals can conceptualize. However, I have students working on conceptual structure, and we're trying to see whether, and in fact we've shown some results where the languages that come out reflect distinctions in the domain, a domain of meanings that are relevant to a particular task. So possibly a discrimination task. So I think we can see, I'm confident that the same techniques can look at the evolution, this kind of cultural evolution of, if you like, the meaning space as well as the signal space. I think these are kind of part and parcel of the same thing.
Well, 2 comments and 2 questions. So you stress cultural transmission, cultural, inheritance. But there are, a number of languages that never had any contact, never. Like Italian and Berber, they are both pro-drop languages. And then you have France, which is close to Italy, it is a non-pro-drop language. And you have valleys close to one another that have this. So, there was no cultural transmission there. And another case is home science that Susan Goldie-Mello has been studying. There is no transmission. These are deaf children from hearing impairment. There is no cultural transmission whatsoever, and they have the organization that they have in their language. So my question is, how do we account for this, after stressing so much cultural evolution? And then my second question, do you really think that the only way that something can be fixed, is through natural selection? Is that the only way you can have something genetically fixed?
So both good questions. So the first question, I think what you're getting at is that you can see in these different systems universal properties that to you would be mysterious if I was, since I'm arguing they arrive through cultural transmission. But that's, and to my mind, that's kind of beside the point. I mean, what we're saying is that we can explain universal properties of language as being, if you like, attractors in the space of dynamical systems that, let me finish, that cultural transmission produces. So, for example, I would expect that in a process, for example, a nice case study would be to compare Nicaraguan Sign Language and the Al-Sa'i Bedouin Sign Language. In those 2 systems, what we've seen is the emergence of these universal properties I've been talking about. In Nicaraguan Sign Language, we have both compositionality and combinatoriality. In the ABSL case, we don't have one of them. And the argument is that in these 2 cases, we have slightly different processes of social transmission. And,
so looking different, not universal.
Sorry.
Well, there are different attractors, but can I answer the second? No, okay. All right. So difference is fine as well, right? These are different stable points in the space of cultural transmission. Your other question was about fixation. I didn't really talk about fixation, but I am happy to concede that there could be properties of the language faculty that are strongly constraining, that are universal, that have nothing to do with natural selection for communication. So in many ways, I support some aspects of the program that you're part of. I think they may not be necessary, but nothing in what I have said has ruled out the possibility that there are, for example, computational constraints or architectural constraints or exaptations from other features of our biology. I think they're all plausible, interesting candidates. I really don't think that we, in this field, are in a position to take one stance versus another, and I think it's a mistake if we do.